Kata-kata tell you, these guys were gorgeous. And I think that the main course is coming out. So here we go. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, so Archbishop Patrick O'Regan, who was born near Bathurst in New South Wales, and grew up in that diocese, and indeed, after his ordination, served in that diocese for nearly 25 years, I think. Really, that long, a long time. I think he had 2 years off for good behaviour, where you went to Paris and studied, and you were the Vicar General just as you left that diocese and went to the Diocese of Sale, which is in Victoria, and you were there, you were made the 9th Bishop of Sale, and then some years later, in the plague year of 2020, I believe, you were translated to Adelaide as also our 9th Archbishop, and we've got to know you a bit since then. That's right. And I must say thank you on behalf of the Knights of South Australia for the assistance you've given us and the support you've given us. So it's my pleasure to welcome the Archbishop. I'd like to say a few words.
I'm delighted to be here this afternoon because it's been a few years since we actually decided to do this, Michael, wasn't it? And it's taken a little while to get here. So I hope it's going to be informing and formational as well. So I've got 3 parts today. First, a reflection. Secondly, a comment on one of Pope Francis's works, and then some reflections on the Synod so far. And there will be a little opportunity for questions. If you ever go to Strasbourg in France, you can go to the museum next to the cathedral and see this piece of stained glass. It's one of the oldest stained glass images of Christ. It's mesmerizing. The colours are vibrant. A little solemn though, isn't it? A few years ago, we were asked to contemplate the face of Christ. And it strikes me that the role of faith is to see the face of Christ in everyone and to allow and enable that to happen. Now, on the 8th of May, 1889, exhausted, ill and out of control, Vincent van Gogh committed himself to St. Paul's Psychiatric Asylum in Saint-Remy de Provence, a small hamlet in the south of France. It was a former monastery, and the sanitarium was located in the area of cornfields, vineyards and olive trees. There, Van Gogh was allowed 2 small adjoining cells with barred windows. One room he used as his bedroom, the other was a tiny studio. While there, Van Gogh not only painted the surrounding areas, and some of you might be familiar with some of his work, and the interior of the asylum, but also he copied. Everyone borrows from someone else. They didn't have such strict laws as we have now. He loved to copy paintings and drawings by other artists, thus learning and honing the craft. But he made them his own by modification. One of the artists that Van Gogh copied and modified was Eugène Delacroix. And this one you see up here is the Good Samaritan. Horse, Good Samaritan, and the person by the wayside. That's the Delacroix, and that's the Van Gogh. And that's inside age. It's a fascinating study. However, you can see the resemblance, but Van Gogh made a significant change to the original composition. He looked at it in a different way. You can see he's reversed the image, can't you? The reversal, which is a very perceptive way of looking at the world and inviting us to change our own position sometimes, can be read in a few ways. In the original Delacroix, on the right, the Samaritan is on the right side, all dressed in red, so our eye goes to that person, doesn't it? Our viewer's eye naturally goes to the right, because we're used to doing that. But Van Gogh reverses it. Not just the horse, but what's important, not necessarily the Samaritan, but the one he's helping. All of us get used to one way of looking at things, and we have that cultural bias. But sometimes we need something like this just to flip it over, to see that things can be seen from a different way. We know the story of the Good Samaritan, but how we read it is most important. And I think Van Gogh, for me, just makes that little contrast. That just by flipping things around, we see what he considers to be important. Now, it's not just things like the horse's hooves. You can see the man's half dead. You can see in the distance, if you look carefully, figures going down the Jericho road, the rocks, an abandoned chest. There's lots of things that start to emerge once we go away from the main trinity of figures. You can see the extraordinary dishevelled man with a bandage on his head, clinging to the rescuer, and the considerable effort of the rescuer, heel lifting from the shoe, lots of details that can sort of start to emerge the more we stay with an image such as that. The ultimate message of, and you can imagine the torment that Vincent was going through at times, but the response, compassion. That emerges, I think, in both of those paintings, but for me, in the Van Gogh one, much stronger. Compassion emerges as an extraordinary force, and it comes up and follows through to action. To help our neighbour, we need to take on their difficulties, to wear, so to speak, their pain, to truly try and understand. That takes a lifetime. This was a momentary encounter that changed both. But in our society today, where we never have time to stop, the word compassion is in danger of sounding a little anachronistic. It's time for us to recover and restore it to its original dignity. in opening our heart to compassion, and just Michael gave me a list of all the extraordinary activities that you have been involved in. So well done, because that's an extraordinary act of compassion with an open and enlarged heart. But it's not a choice everyone makes, and that's very sad, because actually we are made for compassion. And the events in Sydney and all sorts of other places in the last few days just says how vulnerable each person is. And our society, there's some darker clouds than there should be. What's the answer? Compassion. It's a very simple answer, and yet it's so profound. Fast forward to 4 years ago, nearly. Pope Francis wrote a document called Fratelli Tutti, Brothers and Sisters All. And he did it on the eve of the feast day of St. Francis, the 3rd of October, which is the 4th of October. He did it on the 3rd. Now, what I'd like to challenge you to do is to read that sometime. When I go around, even some of our clergy, I said, have you read anything that Pope Francis has written? And sometimes I get stares of blankness. Too busy, or he writes too much, which is true. Doesn't write short ones, needs a good editor. But embedded in all of the documents that he writes are extraordinary biblical reflections upon which to base our whole life. And the beauty of this Fratelli Tutti is chapter 2 has an extended meditation on the parable of the Good Samaritan. So for your formation, I'd encourage you, if you don't read the whole show, at least read chapter 2, because it gives us a glimpse into what compassion actually looks like. Pope Francis says, open your hearts to compassion. Often we think it starts with us. One of the things about faith is we experience God's compassion. We often think we're the agents, or the first agents of it, when in fact we're the second agent. We actually have to feel the compassion of God for ourselves. And I think, the intensity of Lent, which you're going through now, but even the intensity of a Good Friday, the experience of compassion is profound. Even in all the words of Good Friday, just seeing people come up for the adoration of the cross is such an extraordinary thing without words, to see this is the compassion that has come to me. This is that which I need to imitate. Open your hearts to compassion. That's the place to start. Because the kind of God we have wants to be the compassionate one for us. Close yourself off to indifference. And I think we see that in that parable. We live in what they call these days the whatever generation. It's not as if people are against faith, it's that they're indifferent to it. And that's a really hard thing to do. It's, whatever. You can actually struggle against or talk with someone who's got a very different opinion. But when there's an indifference, it's hard. So that's the kind of society we often live in these days. And Pope Francis is trying to respond to that. What do we need in our world? More compassion. And if you look at all of what he's trying to say to the church, there's a little bit of a mistranslation in some of the scriptures that says, "Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect." Well, I look in the mirror every morning and see that that's not the case. But actually the better translation is, "Be compassionate as your heavenly Father is compassionate." Because this is a way in which we can serve the world, love God, love our neighbour, love ourselves, but with that compassionate heart. It's not a weakness, it's actually a great strength. It's very simple. And you do it all the time. Well done. Giving back saves us from indifference. Again, looking through that great catalogue and graphic bars, or whatever they call them, of the extraordinary activities, we're doing it already. But sometimes it's good to ground it in, well, why are we doing what we're doing? Why might we be different from another organisation? It's because it's why we do what we do. Not just the how, and you're doing that very well, but also grounding it in that, because giving back saves us from indifference. So our world is full of indifference, but it was great to see. It wasn't great to see the happenings in the Bondi Junction, but the extraordinary response of people to want to make a difference, not flee in the face of difficulty. The beautiful reflection of that parable comes from this decisive question, and it's one for our own time. Chapter 10 of St. Luke's Gospel. The Gospel writer presents us with a teacher of the law who stands up and asks Jesus the decisive question, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" And instead of giving a quick answer, Jesus responds with another question. What's written in the law? How do you read that there? And the lawyer, of course, should know these things and takes a quote from the book of Deuteronomy. "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength and all your mind, and your neighbour as yourself." And Jesus responds, "You know what? You're right. Do this and you will live." But then the lovely little sting in the tail. It says, "He, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, 'And who is my neighbour?'" And that's the setting for the parable. It's a deep question each of us in our society seeks to answer. In a very dislocated world, being neighbour can be a fearful experience. And somehow we do live in more of a climate of fear than hope. But that's not who we are. But we are people who ask that question. And who is my neighbour? We're seeking to answer that in many ways. We can't be neighbours to everyone, can we? And all of us experience compassion fatigue. It's actually a thing. Because now we flick on the TV and all sorts of social media and things, we find out too many things about too many people, but too many needs. The difficulty is that it can make a barrier rather than a bridge. And if you read Pope Francis all the time, he's always talking about what's the role? Build bridges, not walls. Because it's too easy to build a wall and much more difficult to build a bridge. But bridges are more important than walls. So we've got to fight against a certain indifferentism. Well, it's not my problem. And we see heroic experiences of that. So I guess my thing is really, we want to look about compassion in action. Maybe your next meeting, Michael, you could begin a little reflection on chapter 2 of Fratelli Tutti, because it helps to inform why we do what we do. Not that we've ever forgotten it, I don't think that, because you're doing it wonderfully, but it just helps to give that we're not alone in this. It's actually something we do with the grace of God. Sometimes we forget that. But it's actually God's grace at work in us. Compassion comes to us before we are compassionate. But it makes the difference. It makes our actions not transactional, but relational. And that's the difference in that wonderful pictures there. You can see the relational. One-on-one, literally. Poor old horse, he doesn't seem to get much of a look in, but he's featured very strongly, isn't he? One of the other things that's not in these paintings is our friendly innkeeper. Now, there are other little sketches of some of the great masters that focus on the turning up of the inn. And that's another little... he doesn't get many lines, but actually in the story provides an extraordinary role. This is how it ends, remember. Looking after the wounded person is not just a one-off. It actually takes time. And we need to enlist others. Okay, the innkeeper was paid for his services. Well done. But how would the Samaritan have managed without the innkeeper? We admire him, but he passes unnoticed. I think it's worth reflecting a little bit more on the innkeeper. Because in one sense, we're not only the Samaritan, we're also trying to be the innkeepers. Inns get an interesting role in the scriptures. There was no room at the inn when at Jesus' birth. But here we have in Luke's Gospel, a little bit further, a room where there is, an inn where there is room. There was room for this wounded person. Yes, he was paid, etc., but still, he had to accept the promise of the Samaritan. Look, I'll be back in a few days. I'll make good whatever happens. So that quality of trust goes with it all. So that's the first half an hour. But I wanted to give you something for formation. And I think the whole image of the Good Samaritan is a great place to start. And I think Francis gives us a wonderful insight of what compassion is about. And you're expressing it in so many ways, but it helps us to understand, well, it's not just what we do, it's what we do with the grace of God and God's help. And actually, God has been compassionate to me first. And sometimes we don't even recognise that. But when we stop and think, you know what? I have received the compassion of God. It sort of puts things around the other way. You see, like the paintings. We think we're doing it all, and then we're starting in the wrong place. But if we start with the fact that God is compassionate to us, then it turns around, and then there's a greater sense of giving shape and form to all of our different projects that we do. Because we begin to understand why we do what we do and why it's different from any other organisation. Not only the motivation, but also this thing called grace. I'll just leave that up there because the next little section, I'm going to just give a few brief thoughts even though I've got 39 of them here, about the experience of the Synod. It's hard to talk about a football match halfway through. So the Synod in Rome was convoked by the Pope last October and this October. And it's really hard to talk about the end result halfway through. But I think in my experience of those who went, there's a direct relationship between the level of preparation in each place and the level of comfort. Those who came a little bit angry probably stayed that way. Those who came with an open heart were transformed by the experience, because whatever synodality is, you can only experience it by doing it. One of the direct documents that we had was based on a quote from the prophet Isaiah: "Enlarge the space of your tent." Now, in 40 years, I don't remember ever seeing that particular quote, so forgive me for saying so. But there it is for sure. An extraordinary call to each and every person about the way we live our lives, and who's part of our tent, but also to the whole of the church. The experience of being there was a little bit, again, Lucan, in the sense that it was a bit like, do you remember those characters on the way to Emmaus? They were with Jesus, they saw him from afar, crucified, and they were walking away to the place, from that place of defeat, to somewhere where they knew. I experienced the Synod as a bit of a Emmaus moment, where Francis drew near to the church and was asking, "What are you discussing as you walk along the journey of life and faith?" It was not what should the church be like, but rather what is happening in the church. So the first session last October was a little bit of a diagnostic tool to say what is happening in our world, what is happening in the church. What are you afraid of? What are you hopeful for? So it was really just trying to describe the vast experience. Now, there were 400 people in the hall each day, and it was the church gathered in all its array and diversity. The church has never been uniform. It's always been united, maybe not always as it should be, but just even the kinds of dress that everyone was wearing, etc. The great diversity of experience of the whole of humanity was there in one little snapshot. And of course, the way that diagnostic tool was being used was very different from one place to another. The things that would occupy the imagination of Australia and Western Europe were very different from, say, Eastern Europe and Africa and Asia and South America. Same experience of being the church, different reality. We were asked to look at 3 different things: communion, participation, and mission. Maybe you might have heard of those 3 terms: communion, participation, and mission. And we looked at those for 4 days on a table of 12, a round table. And it was divided up linguistically. And the English group were the bigger ones, but it also included people from China and Germany and Vietnam and anyone that had a smattering of English. And so the English groups were the richest ones, but the more challenging ones linguistically. And we were asked to say, well, what are the convergences? What do we actually agree on in all of these things? What are the divergences? What don't you think should happen? And a lot of people before we got there thought, well, this means that there's going to be a lot more divergencies because there's such a rich tapestry here. When in fact, the convergences were many and the divergences were few. I think that was a product of what we call the conversations in the Holy Spirit. One of the interesting things were we had on each table pretty much a young person from different countries. That was one of the Pope's inclusive desires, to make sure the voice of the young was heard. And on our table, one of the young persons said, "What would I dream the church to be?" And she put it in a beautiful way: an usher, not a bouncer. Now, you have to understand there were 5 languages being spoken at the synod and simultaneous translation, which only works if you have a prepared speech and people can check it up. So God knows, and each table had to have a rapporteur, which was a native English speaker that could do something, so somehow I got that role all the time. But I had no idea what the translators were going to say with ushers, not bouncers. But it was her impression that sometimes the church came across as a bouncer. You're not coming in unless you. And said what our generation looks for are ushers. It's an extraordinary little insight just in a couple of words about the deep desire in to belong, to be heard, yes, but not the only voice. It was a very stereophonic experience. So I thought that was an extraordinary little insight about what the church could be, but how it's often perceived. We're always telling people what we're against, but not always what we're for, or the relational thing, like these 2 characters. Did he have to fill out a form before he sort of got help? But we know the 3 different reactions to the robber, beggar, might he have a knife? All those things that fear can dwell up in us can actually do that. One of the actually extraordinary things was we had a retreat for 3 days. So before we got to the business, we actually prayed. And Father Timothy Radcliffe is a Dominican priest who gave the lectures at the retreat, and you've guessed it, available online for a steal of a price. But actually some of them were extraordinary insights for anyone, not just those that were there. I'll finish with a couple of comments about, there's a lovely lady called Grace, who comes from the back blocks of New Guinea, who was a delegate. And all the Oceania group, even though we make up 0.8 of 1% of all the Catholics in the world, we had something like 25 representatives. So we were quite overstocked in one way, but it was great to have that momentum, including our own John Lakoviak from here. But I remember Grace. She's a single mum, a catechist, deeply, an overused word, passionate about her faith. And it would have cost, I think it was the first time she'd ever been out of New Guinea, let alone anywhere else. Had to come to Australia first, and in those days there was a flight from Perth, I think, direct to Rome. And it was overwhelming for her. And yet people asked her, well, what was the experience coming from a place like New Guinea? She said, well, actually, we're a fairly young Christian country, in the sense that a lot of the missionaries that came to us had a deep experience of Vatican II. And actually, even though we have a very tribal structure, some patriarchal, a lot matriarchal, it's still very structured. So, for example, the chief, he or she, will call a sing sing, which means a gathering for 6, 7, 8, how many days, who knows, just come. And to the frustration of perhaps other Westerners, nothing had happened for a whole week. But what was happening was people were getting to know each other again. The relational took place before the transactional. And the business only happened in the last day. And then it was handed off to the chief and say, well, you do whatever you like, we've done our bit. But we felt we're being part of the process. So sort of synodality is a little bit like that. It's not about the business. In the first instance, it's about the people. It's about rekindling the experience of hope of this, like our friends, the Good Samaritan. That comes before anything else. So I always think of Grace and pray deeply for her that experience, which is so natural and built on the ordinary experience, we've sort of lost that in a little way, because we've become a little bit more adversarial. I'm here, you're there, and let's fight, rather than what do we have together. And whatever else about the difficult term synodality, which it is, it's much easier to say on the road together. And you see where Vincent has chosen to take the photo and the painting, it's on the road. And it seems like he's just sort of, is he putting him on? Is he taking him off? What's he doing? Well, you fill in the blanks. But there's an encounter, there's a cost. And different shades of red. One's got a hat, one's got a coat. So you can look at all that up on the internet as well. But to me it's a striking image. Because we live in a very image-conscious time. So it's not just words. So my simple message is compassion. For you as a formational element, helping us understand why we do what we do, a great place to start is the parable of the Good Samaritan. Because that actually helps and informs us. First of all, compassion comes to us, but second, we are to be compassionate. And all that litany of things you've done are expressions of that. I'm not here to say you're not doing anything, you are. But let's do it with that deep sense of purpose about why we do it, and well done. And then just a couple of little insights into the synod process. I'm happy to take any questions if you like, but my time is well and truly finished. So thank you very much, and I do hope the Fratelli Tutti is simply available on the internet anywhere. You can buy copies from St. Paul's or whatever. It is a little longer than perhaps it should be, like this talk. But if you're going to start somewhere, start with chapter 2. An extended meditation on the Good Samaritans. And we've all experienced what a Good Samaritan is. We can be the Samaritan, the innkeeper. Sometimes we might feel like the bloke in the ditch. But we try not to be the people of indifference who simply walk on by. Thank you. Any questions? You can wake up now. Thank you very much.
That was terrific. Thank you very much. Really appreciate that. And of course, it's just wonderful that you've been able to come here and share those thoughts with us. Much appreciated. And because nobody had any questions, then they've obviously been totally pleased with everything that you've said. Or asleep. A couple are asleep, but not too many, that's good. Alright, well now we've got dessert coming out. Tea and coffee.